Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy. Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the South African energy sector into digestible insights. In today's episode, we will be diving into one of the most promising technologies for South Africa's energy future, battery storage. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and in today's episode, we will be unpacking the power that lies behind battery storage, its ability to stabilize the grid, and provide reliable energy access in remote areas. For this conversation, we will be joined by a panel of experts who are pioneering efforts in this space and have valuable insights to share on the opportunities and the challenges that are presented by battery storage. To kick off this episode, I'd like to get started with some introductions of our guests. Monde, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your current role in the energy sector.
Thank you, Thokozile. As having been introduced briefly, my name is Monde Soni, and I'm the chair or the chairman of the Power and Energy section, which is under the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers. Basically, what we do there is we provide a platform for the advancement of the electrical engineering career in the country and also in the region. So this is the Southern African region. So by qualification, my normal day-to-day job, I'm a power systems engineer, and I deal with network planning, studies, and more focused or specializing with the energy storage or battery energy storage integration. So within SAIEE, what we have done is we have established a number of smaller formations that we call chapters. And one of those chapters that we have is called Energy Storage Chapter, which is led by a very brilliant chairperson. Her name is Gracia. And they are also looking at the battery energy, generally the energy storage aspects, and trying to open it up and make sure that, the general public gets to understand exactly what the capabilities of the battery energy or the energy storage, are. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that introduction, Monde. Phemelo, if I can ask you to please briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your current role in the South African energy sector, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Phemelo Mitchell. I am currently on this platform as an advisor for the CNI Solar and Storage Summit, but my current role encompasses me overseeing the procurement of electrons. I work for an energy-intensive user, and I am also overseeing the execution of the electromobility aspect for the energy-intensive user.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Phemelo. Gracia, I'd like to ask you, please, if you could briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your current role in the South African energy sector.
Thank you very much, Thokozile. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this platform. So my name is Gracia Munganga. I'm a trained chemical engineer, but I think in the context of what's relevant for this conversation, I used to work for a systems integrator based in South Africa, and our primary, role was to provide containerized solar PV and battery energy storage systems. We started with relatively small systems for electrification and then expanded to commercial and industrial applications, especially at the height of some of the load shedding challenges. I wear two hats. I volunteer for an organization called the Africa Circular Economy Network, and the role of circular economy in, enabling the just energy transition is also very topical for this conversation. Currently, I work for a program that looks at electrifying health facilities in some of the most remote communities across the continent. Very nice to be here. Back to you, Thokozile.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that introduction. Maloba, if you could briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your current role in the South African energy sector.
Thank you very much, Thokozile, and thank you for having me on this platform. My name is Maloba Tshehla, as you said. I'm currently the head of advisory at an advisory firm called ED Platform. And what we do is we advise renewable energy players within with regards to economic development. So that entails all of the, let's call it the triple BE and economic development and ESG aligned part of rolling out infrastructure. So we have a very good view and understanding of the renewable energy space. And with that, in the past year or so, has been the growth of the battery energy storage space as well. And we're also participating at various levels within the industry, including at SAIEE and SAIEE. So there's an understanding of, from our perspective specifically, how we ensure economic development as we roll out infrastructure. And that is also the case with battery energy storage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Maloba. And I think it's a really important point that you're raising in terms of, we have to really be mindful of economic development and socioeconomic development issues as we look at various solutions and various technologies. And lastly, I'd like to ask Tumi to please introduce herself. Tumi, if you could briefly just share about your current role in the South African energy sector, and just a bit more about the organization that you have set up.
Yes, my name is Tumi Mphahlele. I'm co-founder and director at a company called iGen. We locally assemble lithium-ion batteries. These batteries are used mostly in the assembly of in the installation of renewable energy projects, and we are based in Johannesburg. My role as a co-founder was to start the business from scratch. Two other co-founders. We grew that business to this day. We've been on this journey for about 6 years.
Very exciting. And to me, I think you've done quite a lot of exciting work in the energy sector, and especially in battery storage, which is probably not the easiest of industries to get involved in. Now I'd like us to really just dig in and get straight into today's topics, and really want to start this first round of questions with really setting the scene and trying to understand what is the role of battery storage in South Africa's energy sector currently. And Maloba, I'd like to start off with you in setting the stage. Could you provide an overview of battery storage in South Africa, and specifically what role does it currently play in the energy sector, and why is it crucial to South Africa's broader energy transition?
Absolutely. Thanks, Thokozile. I think South Africa's energy journey, and we call it an energy transition, has been ongoing effectively for the past 12 or so years, primarily in the form of a very large-scale procurement program run by government for renewable energy generation capacity. What that has done has been to change the energy conversation altogether, not only from a generation source perspective, but also from a generation player perspective. So we've had the introduction of independent power producers through that program. And off the back of that, honestly, has grown an entire energy market. We have now commercial industrial scale players providing direct business to business power purchase agreements. Now, with that increase and change in the landscape, what we have seen are multiple things, one of which has been grid constraints, because the way the program has run has effectively been places with the best wind and solar resources have seen an increase in the development of renewable energy projects. But the grid upgrading and the grid extension to allow increased flow of generation from those sites hasn't followed suit, right? So we now have a situation where there's massive investment required in grid and transmission to evacuate power effectively from high resource areas to consumption areas. Now, in that context, And of course, in the context of load shedding, which, touch wood, hasn't been an issue this year, but is still very much part of how we need to think of planning, comes in the role of battery energy storage. And so at this stage, we've had effectively 2 rounds of what we call utility scale battery energy storage procurement run by government again. There have been some procurement from Eskom, but I think on the largest scale, it's run through the IPP office. And so what battery storage is doing now is effectively going to specific nodes in the grid where there are constraints and providing the storage capacity in order to provide what are called ancillary services, effectively allowing for the grid to absorb high generation periods of renewables, and then also respond to grid demands at times of lower generation. And so you're starting to get a more integrated grid where there's the storage capacity to kind of smooth out generation in line with consumption. And so what we're seeing with this is basically an interest from multiple multinationals coming into South Africa to provide technology. And I think if we think about the broader energy transition, and I'm going to add the just energy transition, if that's what we want to achieve, we have an opportunity as we procure large-scale government-led infrastructure to make sure that local manufacturing and minerals extraction that is happening in South Africa. There's a few companies we can mention, and I think one of our panelists also, is very much in that space. There's an opportunity to ensure that we anchor local production, local content with this procurement program. I think to close off this point, and we'll get back to it probably in the conversation, if we take lessons from wind and solar procurement over the past 11, 12 years, we know what it is that we need to do in terms of consistent supply, consistent rules of engagement, consistent requirements around local content to actually catalyze investment into competitive, large-scale economic production of local solutions, specifically battery energy storage, which we do have capacity for in South Africa. And I think when we think of a just energy transition, this is what we have the opportunity to do with battery energy storage.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Maloba. And you've touched on a key point around the grid and the implications that battery storage has then on grid stability. And Gracia, I'd like to bring you into the conversation in unpacking this further for us and just ask you to just explain then, how does battery storage technology work in supporting grid stability, and how can battery storage enhance the overall reliance, or the resilience rather, of South Africa's energy system?
Thank you, Thokozile. And I think Maloba's introduction was perfect, into this topic. So overall, not just in South Africa, when we talk about, the value of battery storage in supporting, let's say, grid operations, there's 3 key things that come to mind. The first one is improved management of power and power supply, and demand. There's improved flexibility and reliability. So let's zoom into the context of South Africa, building from what Maloba has said. I think that the renewable energy contribution to our electricity mix is just under 10%, depending on the different sources of references that you read about. And so when you look at some of the challenges that Maloba mentioned, which is we've got these nodes of, let's say, excess capacity, but grid constraint with the ability to evacuate that power. But large-scale battery storage system, particularly in this instance, respond directly to that need. So as you know, and most of the people that are very vocal against renewable energy will often use the argument that, you can only generate power when the sun shines and when the wind blows, essentially. So renewable energy power is intermittent. And so large-scale storage facilities, particularly located closer to generation plants, for example, provide the flexibility to be able to store the excess power when it's generated during the day, or during high, let's say, wind periods, and then dispatch it during periods of high demand or during peak loads. I think that would be number one. The second, when we look at how battery storage supports, let's say, grid stability, would be looking at frequency regulation. So I'm not a physicist, but in the context of South Africa, I understand it's roughly about 50 hertz, and a mismatch between power demand and power supply can lead to frequency shifts or frequency imbalances, which then affects the stability of the grid and can lead to power disruptions, outages, etc. With large-scale power system, battery storage system, they have the ability to respond almost immediately to frequency shift by either directly in absorbing the excess power and or injecting it into the grid, depending on what's causing the imbalance. And then lastly, it's not just applicable, I would say, to the grid operations, but it would also be applicable, I think Phemelo can speak about it, in the commercial and industrial sector, peak shaving. So during periods when the grid is overburdened, during high demands, and when we've all experienced it, especially during previous months with load shedding. So battery storage are able to support and reduce the load on existing power plants. This avoids disruptions and also prevents grid instability. The excess power can then be drawn from the battery storage. Sorry. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Gracia. Very fascinating. And I guess, further highlighting the point that, battery has the ability, or it does then support grid stability, but also highlighting that at a macro level, then that battery storage then assists in managing the load and the supply and supplying then the relevant load by then being able to provide that base load coverage that you wouldn't find for intermittent renewable energy sources. So even though the sun is not shining, you are still then able to access the power that's being generated by those solar plants, for example. And also, I guess, touching on the fact that that battery in itself, or the use of battery technologies, also then presents some great opportunities for commercial and industrial users in South Africa. And Phemelo, I'd like to bring you into the conversation and at this point in the sense that, we're seeing that battery storage systems are gaining traction amongst commercial and industrial users in South Africa. Can you discuss some of the key benefits that these systems have been able to offer businesses?
Thank you, Thokozile. So from my point as an end user, or what I could say is an energy intensive user, we are seeing the progress that's made in South Africa with regards to the developing battery and energy storage system, and we understand that the integration of renewable energy can be supported through the grid through this factor. One of the primary benefits is cost saving. We all know that as a business that's running, we want to increase our profit margins, and that is indirectly proportional to the cost savings. By storing energy during these off-peak times when electricity is cheaper and used during these times where the prices are higher, I think businesses can significantly reduce their energy bills, of course. And we also understand the independency of energy on the national grid. That is one of the benefits that we understand comes with battery storage. Another benefit that we are becoming aware of is flexibility in the energy management aspect. And one of the key matters that were addressed by our panelists is addressing the grid congestion, managing energy costs, increasing renewable energy consumption, and also the capability to providing backup power are some of the key benefits that come with offerings of battery energy storages for our systems. Thanks, Thokozile.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much, Phemelo. Some great points raised, and also really highlighting a key benefit from a cost perspective. And it's really exciting to see how battery storage is becoming a valuable asset for businesses. But what does it actually look like when one actually considers or wants to build a business in battery storage and around this technology. And Tumi, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here and get your take as an entrepreneur and a leader in South Africa's battery storage space. Could you share some of the key challenges and opportunities that you've encountered in building your business in this area, and as well as also what unique aspects of the South African energy market have really shaped your journey in building your business?
You know, in South Africa, there was huge opportunity, and maybe that opportunity still exists, where energy availability was a bit of a problem. It's not very difficult for anyone to understand exactly where we come from, even though at this point it looks like it might have subsided. But the biggest opportunity was exactly that there was almost a time when we could not actually build enough batteries. And as a result, the challenge was making sure that we can meet that demand, but at the right price. The biggest challenge for a small business is whether they can actually meet the right price, and mostly that comes in because of the amount of stock you can buy. For example, the amount of cost you incur when you bring stuff in. You know, when you don't have deep pockets, you do not have the benefit of scale, and so the challenges for us was exactly that. Right from the beginning, right at the beginning, when you are starting out, you need to compete with people that have been in the business for a while. You do not have the benefit of scale. You are buying your inputs at a much higher cost, yet you are expected to compete at exactly the same level. And so navigating that was a bit of a good challenge, and making sure that you still can hold your cash flows, can still hold. And then within all of that, defining processes, defining supply chains, and then you have to look for funding at the same time. So this is a manufacturing business in essence. So it is capital intensive, and it needs patient capital. So you don't get to see returns as quickly as many other businesses. And so trying to convince people to invest in a company that is new, that is in a sector that is that has demand, but where there is a substantial amount of material that comes in from outside of the country, where it is even cheaper. So those are the kind of challenges that we've had to navigate and actually win through, because at this point it gets better over time. You are able to get the funding, you are able to also bring in items at the right level, etc. And then the last big challenge that no one ever talks about enough is also the skills challenges. In our country, for small business, you do not have access of the greatest skills that you can get, the greatest skills that money can buy. So you have to navigate that, balance your skills requirements. And remember, this type of business, you need skilled engineers, you need skilled battery designers, you need people that know how, or almost upward of electrical engineers to actually help you grow the business. So those are the challenges, but the demand side was really the big opportunity.
Thank you for that, Tumi. It's really inspiring to hear about the entrepreneurial journey that you've undertaken, and also I guess we realize that battery storage then also faces challenges, not just from a starting and establishing a business in the area, and as you've said, you've highlighted some of the challenges that you've had to overcome in establishing your business, but there's also an impact in terms of and we've touched on this, but I'd like us to elaborate more on it. But when it comes to integrating battery storage then into existing infrastructure, and Monde, I'd like to get your views then from an engineering perspective, and really trying to get an understanding of what are the primary challenges in integrating battery storage into or into South Africa's existing energy infrastructure, and how can these challenges be addressed?
Yeah, thank you, Thokozile. So I think, you know, with all the positives that have been mentioned and some of the challenges as well, any technology that is starting up, that is still new, will have some challenges at the beginning. So I have listed a few of them just, you know, on top of my head. The first one being the issue of cost. So I think there is a cost curve on any new technology. We may have seen this on PV when the solar PVs started. There is a certain curve that they followed. Initially, the cost being very high, and a few years later, the cost dropping. So currently, the cost seems to be quite a challenge for most applications. And maybe just to expand on that, for example, we did a study in windy areas such as the Greater Cape areas in the country, and we realized that when you have to, if you want to address congestion issues that are emanating from the wind generation, using battery energy storage, you know, the economics and the results of your economic assessments start not to be favorable, but it becomes more favorable if you use batteries to shift wind, you know, because, to shift solar PV. Because, you know, for example, solar is highly predictable. You know, it's going to be up almost every day. There are a few days where there is no sun than those that do have sun. So you tend to know exactly from which time to what time there will be the sun, and then you can use now the batteries to cover your peak times, etc. But with wind, then you start to have the challenges where, for example, the wind will blow for a long time. It will go for days without stopping, and now to try and cover for that, you need to size your battery to be able to capture all that energy. So that is just one of the challenges. And also another one is the experience currently. New technology, really new experience, and we don't have that kind of knowledge base at an adequate level, you know, in terms of the technical skills of operating and maintaining, and also just saying for a fact, you know, that this type of battery will deplete, or, you know, it will be finished by after so many years. Someone who has run that, who has tried it, who has tested it, and they have got data, you need to wait for the same number of years so that you can see that. So that remains a challenge. And I think now with that one, the interesting part is that the only thing you can do is to wait. You install and you wait and you see whether, you know, what is actually written on the nameplate really will conform in real life. Will it really last for 10 years? And also the experience that you have, you can only gain it as time goes. But also to also try and close the gap. I mean, I mentioned that I'm with SAIEE. You know, platforms such as SAIEE, we also provide training for installers, for you know, maintenance and operating, etc. And we collaborate with, you know, other players as well to try and provide the platform to provide the training, which will then close the gap of experience. But just coming now to the grid itself, the Yes, batteries play a very important role, and I think we have seen this by the programs that are being run by the IPP office. We've seen this by the rollout that's being done by ESCOM. But there are just some certain detailed, challenges, such as the grid strength at certain areas in the country, where, for example, you want to provide ancillary services which are needed by the grid, but because of the strength of the grid, that's a bit of a nerdy answer that I'm going to give, because I'm an engineer. So the grid strength, you find that you have a challenge, but also the nature of the batteries currently being more grid following, the inverters that we have out there, that really doesn't assist much in terms of the grid strength. And so meaning that while you can use it to solve the problem, but there are also certain challenges that, become a limiting factor. So I think overall, I can say that there is no, well, let me say batteries are a solution, and they are part of the solution. And we need to include them as part of the mix, as part of the energy mix in the country. I think I will stop there for now in terms of challenges. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Monde. And you've also touched on a skills deficit that we then have in that area. And I think when we then speak of skills deficits, it then speaks to, the broader issue or the broader question then of how can we ensure that battery adoption then sufficiently stimulates local development. And with that, Maloba, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation around this aspect, in that, you've mentioned the government procurement programs that have taken place in the battery space. And with what we've seen from the renewable energy independent power producers program, historically really producing significant economic development gains, I'd like to understand from you then, how does the battery energy storage procurement program promote in investment in battery storage, but also specifically what have been the economic and social benefits that it can bring, or that can be brought to local communities in under this program?
Yeah, I mean, that is focal to the work that we do. I think I'd like to start first saying we've had a REAP, this renewable energy IPP program. As I've mentioned earlier, we're on year 12 and counting of it. And what that program has done is basically it has flung out the leading technologies in terms of PV and wind and other technologies into what I often refer to as rural and remote South Africa, right? So in the most far out places across the country, you have effectively being built and operated some of the latest in renewable and wind technology, right? And very soon, because the first round of battery energy storage projects are about to start construction very soon. And in fact, we actually have battery projects from the risk mitigation independent power producer program that started in 2020. So we actually have PV and battery and wind and battery projects that are very close to operations. And what that has done is, again, it has taken what were at that point sort of the leading technologies in battery to rural and remote South Africa, right? So that does two things from a social and a skills impact. So leading on from the skills deficit, you now have communities in very far out places that within that community, you've got a facility which is generally sort of as advanced in the world as you're going to get, on sort of average. And there's an opportunity through industry initiatives, through project initiatives, to actually say, hey, learner in place X, here is a cutting edge technology. a hybrid PV and a hybrid wind with battery storage, or a single battery storage facility. Come and understand what that means. And by the way, due to the way that the battery energy program is structured, again, through the IPP office, there are commitments built in towards socioeconomic development, towards skills development. So there's a funding requirement to do local economic development, as you have said. But I'd like to think of it as that in that we actually have live examples also of cutting edge technology in these communities. So you are not just sponsoring learners to go and get an education, or doing social upliftment projects, but you have a technology that you can demonstrate, a facility that you can demonstrate to say, in the world of battery storage, this is just about as advanced as it gets. Obviously, it's growing year on year. So I think there's a synergy there between having these facilities in rural and remote South Africa, having funding obligations to develop skills, to develop capabilities, and merging those two things so that those communities are starting to see that this technology isn't a foreign thing. It's one that we have here, we can touch and see it, and we can benefit from it. And the beauty of it, learning from the REAP, is that it's built in. So those projects have requirements to do this, and the call to industry is around doing this in a meaningful way.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, really. Thank you for that. And I guess it is exciting to hear that, there is scope, or there has been consideration around participation opportunities for local communities in these projects. And I also, and I guess beyond just value chain opportunities, so whether, we've provided the necessary skills, or, entrepreneurship opportunities, or any kind of participation opportunities in these large scale projects. Battery also, and I would think also then, has the potential to transform energy access, and especially in rural areas. So we're no longer speaking about these large scale battery projects, but rural electrification projects that can be supported by battery storage. And Gracia, I'd like to bring you back in here, and just in discussing, particularly in the work that you've been able to do, how have you seen battery storage being able to improve electricity access in remote communities, and what technical considerations are involved in making this a viable solution across South Africa?
Thanks a lot, Thokozile. So I think before I delve into like battery storage in the context of energy access, I'd like to maybe build off two comments that the previous speakers mentioned, so Monde and Maloba, and just highlight, I think that sometimes the South African industry focuses on the challenges rather than, the successes or the opportunities. So one particular comment about skills development and the need, yes, that is true. We do need to do more. We need to have more expert and trained engineers. But at the same time, I think if you look at the journey that the industry has been through over the last, let's say, 5-7 years, I would say that South Africa on the continent is the largest storage market, right? And we've got 3 of the largest battery manufacturers on the continent. We've got the first gigafactory in Cape Town, right? Solar MD. And so it is by no means, we have not arrived, if I could quote unquote, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize the growth of the industry, and kudos to the work that Maloba, Phemelo, and Monde are doing, because it supported the growth of the industry. So coming back to the point about the role of energy access. So putting it into context, across the continent, energy access remains a significant challenge. I think on average, the electrification rate is about 40%. And if you look at rural areas, it can be as low as 2 or 5%, right? And there's a clear correlation between economic development, and access to power. Multiple studies have been done. In the context of South Africa, it's almost the opposite. About 80, 85, 90% of the country is electrified. Kudos to all the effort that have gone into that. But there is a remaining 8 to 10% of remote communities where you could build and extend the grid, but it would just not be the most cost-effective option. And so what has been called mini grids, it would be these decentralized power systems with their own low voltage distribution network would be the best, both technical but also economic solution. When you look at technology-wise, I think there's been multiple studies that have shown that in some instances, it is up to 40% cheaper to connect communities using solar PV powered mini grids than to try and extend the grid, and or even worse, I say worse, but the alternative would have been power these communities using a diesel generator. And so when you look and you focus on solar PV powered mini grids, the role of battery storage becomes critical, right? So the sun shines during, I don't know, 8 to 10 hours, depending on where you find yourself on the continent. Economic activities sometimes do not stop, right? So the battery storage, the role of battery storage at a much smaller scale, depending on the community, depending on the size, becomes critical to provide power for these peak periods where, let's say, the sun is not shining, and or if it was a wind power mini grid, the wind is not blowing. And in that instance, so some of the challenges I'll just talk about what we've seen in the previous role that I was. The biggest challenge usually is being able to size your batteries in a way that remains economically viable. So if you look at the setup of these communities, many of them have very limited economic opportunities and or revenue opportunities. So the tariff is usually as close to lifeline as possible. You might be lucky and have 1 or 2 anchor commercial clients, and those would be shops, restaurants, or I'm trying to find the right word, but it will come back, that are able to pay you a premium for the power because their income is directly linked with availability of power. But the rest really are being cross-subsidized. And so being able to size your storage, the size of your storage system well is critical. The second is the systems are typically installed in very remote areas, sometimes with difficult access to internet connectivity. And in the case of, and I think Monde mentioned that operation and maintenance is key to maximize the life of your asset. So you're looking at 10, you're looking at 20 years. The only way you can do that is having access to remote monitoring to ensure that you are optimizing the life of your asset through its operation and through maintenance. And so access to what happens when there's, I don't know, a blown fuse, or for some reason there's a frequency shift, you're not able to see what is causing miscoms between the inverter and the battery, etc., becomes challenging. And so how the industry has responded is making sure that someone within the area is trained, and that's a direct job opportunity for the community that becomes sort of the lead or the mandated operation and maintenance officer. They would often be supported by then either the OEM or the developer in an urban center not too far, or sometimes even further, OEM based outside of the continent to support operation and maintenance. And so in the context of coming back to your question, what technology advancement, if I understood your question correctly, contributes to that. One is recognizing as an industry, recognizing as a country that mini grid is not, a downgrade from grid infrastructure. In some instances, it's probably the only way to electrify some communities. The second would be ensuring that, and we've seen that with developers that have ignored the inclusion of the communities, it doesn't often lead to a successful project, right? So the only way, yes, you can have the best engineers and ship them in the middle of nowhere, but they will not live there for the rest of their life. What's really important is ensuring that there's a handover and that there's a training process put in place for the community. And then lastly, I will talk about, and people don't always talk about it often, when people talk about the cost of storage, they say, well, it's too expensive. But what is really expensive? At the end of the day, making sure that you do your due diligence on the kind of equipment that you use. So yes, the CapEx can be cheap, but what kind of warranties do you have on the equipment? What happens when, everyone is currently issuing warranties of 10 years and plus. what happens actually when, you know, one of the batteries or the modules is faulty? Do you get that replaced and shipped in the middle of nowhere? So it's really important to understand the value chain of the equipment, the warranty that's attached, and also after-sales support service that you would be getting from where you purchase the equipment. And something that's often been ignored is it's not really about the battery, it's about the integration of the system and how the battery interacts with PV panel via the inverters, and how the battery system is able to manage, let's say, demand in communities. So what we've also seen is the moment that you have enough power is like data, then communities start realizing, I could have a fridge, I could start selling, you know, maybe some cool drinks, I could maybe start cooking on the side, I could have a TV, and people, I charge people to come watch sports or games, you know, at my house and make money. So when you size, usually by the time you size your system in the next, I don't know, 3-6, especially in peri-urban area, the demand will grow significantly. So how do you, it's almost a, you know, it's quite a tedious exercise trying to predict how the demand will go. Sometimes it's well below what you predicted, but oftentimes it can also be grow rapidly, significantly what you expected it to be. So being able to have, and that's what in the previous role we did, we provided modular containerized storage systems. So it allows you to grow as the demand, it allows you to add capacity as the demand grows. There was also, if you talk about to manufacturers, there are requirements around, you know, temperature control, etc. So making sure that it's in an air-conditioned environment that would not affect the warranty of the batteries, etc. So all these factors, right at a large-scale facility that would support the grid stability, are still relevant for small-scale applications. And ignoring, in my experience, ignoring that at the beginning, in the, you know, with the goal of cost savings, usually ends up costing much more later on. So we had been brought on board a number of times to try and replace systems that were supposed to have a 10-year warranty, but were no longer operating 2 years in. And so those are the kind of mistakes that we've seen across the industry. And those are the kind of, that my hope is that as an industry, we'll have conversations around the true cost of storage and how that reflects in someone's business model. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that. And Gracia, you've touched on quite a myriad and number of points. You know, firstly, you know, the fact that there really is a real opportunity in terms of rural electrification with the support of battery storage. Although there are some challenges that are linked to it, and in ensuring that you've actually sized the system appropriately, and there's sufficient in economic activity in that area to get a decent tariff out. None of these challenges appear to be insurmountable, and in fact, it really then just speaks to the fact that you know, all of these challenges actually present opportunities, and that we really need our we need governments, we need funders to really be coming to the table and really be thinking about how do we solve for some of these challenges so that we can actually ensure that we are enabling the stimulation of economic activities. And Phemelo, I'd like to bring you back in here and really then, when we are thinking about these challenges and how do we then overcome these challenges, I think a key element to consider, or worth considering then, would be in the form of incentives. And I want to just hear from you, you know, are there any kind of financial incentives that are available for businesses looking to invest in this technology? And how accessible have these programs been?
Thank you so much, Thokozile. I'd like to take it a step back, right, and have us assess the entire value chain for battery energy storage systems. The opportunities lie in the entire value chain, which encompasses manufacturing of storage components, the batteries, the cells, and the packs, you know, and the balance of the system. Incentives are one thing that we can look into, and from a local perspective, the Department of Trade and Industry are giving opportunities for incentives. However, one can also focus in investing into the entire value chain. Locally, South Africa depends on imported batteries. And when I say local, I'm referring to South Africa and Africa. However, the capabilities for us to give those minerals for the production of these technologies are in our own continent's minerals. So one avenue to start looking and investing in is, the mining sector, to look at opportunities there, to see where one can benefit, as we know that the minerals used in these components come from our own grounds, our own resources. So that's one avenue one can look into, and one can also look into the R&D aspect to look at what opportunities are coming, what opportunities still are needed to be developed, and where the growth of the economy and industrialization can grow. Locally in South Africa, the Industrial Development Cooperation of South Africa is a national development finance institution which sets up to promote economic growth and industrialization from a local aspect, from a South African. That's where one can go into. However, investing in the minerals for the value chain are aspects that one can also invest in.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I love the point that you're making about it is about unpacking that value chain so that we can also then see what are the ancillary industries or opportunities that battery storage then really has the ability to present to the South African economy. And I think key to that and a key industry that can really then be supported or that can be energized in us localizing the manufacturing of batteries is then South Africa's manufacturing industry. And Tumi, I'd like to bring you back into this and get your thoughts around building a competitive battery manufacturing industry and hear from you. What funding have you been able to tap into in order to set up your business? And what have been the main challenges and opportunities in establishing a competitive battery manufacturing industry in South Africa, especially considering that China has kind of taken the lead in this technology?
The kind of funding that we were able to get over the years is almost your private equity type, and because it's mostly capital intense, you really cannot get a simple bank loan, because with a simple bank loan you have to start paying back almost immediately what has been advanced to you. So a lot of people would argue that, look, why would you want equity? Because it's expensive, but when you don't have that, it's even more expensive. So those are the kind of balances. So over time, we've been able to get a number of equity players that have the patience, and that also bring along not just the funding, but also other kinds of support, and the guidance and knowing that they are not here for 3 years, maybe they're here with you for much longer. And so on the issue of competition, it is very where you have to compete directly with Chinese and other importers. It means that you have to continuously improve. And we had at some point also looking at where else or how else we can manufacture so that we remain competitive. That still remains to this day. And also what we sometimes do not talk about enough is how the energy industry itself is so erratic. It can drive huge demand, and then it can drive it will get to a point where the demand is so low that you are not so sure whether where in your value chain you need to slow down, where in your development you need to actually slow down, and not just it's not just in storage, it's everything else. So those kind of challenges. So because of that demand that is so erratic, even the pricing is erratic. So you have to manage that. You know, if the price goes down, that helps. But in some cases, the price goes up, then you have to manage customers and you know, and your existing contracts and deals, we have to relook at. So, but all in all, the industry itself has been fairly robust. And in where we are at this point is probably just consolidating because load shedding in South Africa is slowing down. But we know that in the rest of the continent, there is no load shedding or no load shedding. It's just a fairly constant, much more constant than we have in South Africa.
Thank you very much for that, Tumi. A strong local manufacturing industry could really set South Africa apart, and hopefully we are not too late in putting in place some of these interventions. Monde, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation and discuss another key aspect, or go back to again a very key aspect of battery storage, which we have touched on, which we've touched on before, but I'd like us to be able to just expand again around battery storage and its role, or as a tool for improving grid stability. And I'd like to just hear from you if you can explain how these, you know, how are we able to ensure that we are contributing to a more reliable power supply in South Africa, and what kind of support what kind of support actually exists in terms of existing energy infrastructure? If I can just bring you back just in terms of the technical elements.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Thokozile. So the battery energy storage has a huge role to play in our current power system. And one that has been mentioned a few times is the stability. And I want to be more specific now and say voltage stability. So you'll realize in areas where we have a high share of renewable energy, specifically PV, you realize that when there is high generation from the solar generators in the area, we tend to experience a voltage rise that is localized in those networks. And if you pair that up, if you pair that solar generation with PV, with batteries, then you tend to have a very good way to control those voltage rise and voltage fall issues. Suddenly you've got a huge output coming from the solar, and then boom, you've got a cloud cover, and you get the fluctuations that you know emanate from there, and the battery becomes that perfect fit to come in as a load when required, and also come in as a generator when required, and that is very, very unique to battery energy storage. Also, the fact that maybe one would say the pumped storage can also do that, which is hydro based pumped storage, but you cannot establish pumped storage anywhere and everywhere in the country, but you can do that now with the battery energy storage. So added to that, you know, the voltage stability issues, we also have congestion relief. I think you may have seen the Eskom-based projects that are distributed in the country. Some of them are sitting in areas that have got high renewable energies. They are meant to facilitate the connection of renewable energy and to deal with the issues of network congestion. And you may have seen between one of the batteries, which is called SIP1. It was placed in the Northern Cape. SIP2 was then placed in Northwest, and SIP3 has been placed in Free State. And all those areas, if you look carefully, you'll realize that there is something common in all of them, which is the high solar generation or high solar resource. And the batteries are there to assist in absorbing all that excess generation during the day and make it available through the system during the system peak when the system really requires them the most. Now, also lately, well, maybe in the recent past, the system has experienced both high frequency and low frequency events. Someone did mention about the high and well, the frequency being 50 hertz. So the system operator is there to ensure that the frequency is as close as possible to 50 hertz, or at least within the dead band. And now what we have realized is in the recent years, we experience cases where the frequency does go up and also the frequency within the same days also comes down. And that will mainly at night be because you have a high generation from the wind and there is no load because the people are sleeping and the factories have closed down during the nighttime. So the load is lower. So you've got this supply demand imbalance. So that becomes a sweet spot to apply batteries to come in as a load and to try and pull down the frequency back to the safe operating areas. And that is something that is not, in the generators, in the conventional generators, that is something that is not really possible. You can't apply them as a load when you need a load. So we may have seen those who are involved in the IPP procurement processes of batteries may have seen the requirements for ancillary services there. The South African system operator now requires what we call fast frequency response. And really right now, only batteries can actually provide that kind of response at that speed. Batteries are able to inject and absorb power within 20 milliseconds. And now the requirements currently from the procurement through this IPP process are that your battery must be able to activate or to respond within 400 milliseconds. And I hope that with time we can actually learn more and realize more that we can actually push these batteries even lower than 400 milliseconds down to maybe 50 milliseconds so that we get the fast response that we need. That is really required by the grid. And I think lastly, the application of batteries, and I just want to come back to that in the rural areas. This is something that Eskom has started doing a lot in rolling out microgrids in those areas that are difficult to actually access. And the DMRE has been very, very supportive, also trying to draft some policies that support that process to ensure that we have universal access in the country. There are business cases there that are really, really positive. And I can pick one that I've also published in the recent year, well, I think this year, which was an area in the Northern Cape called Noneput. I published the paper via SAIEE, and I think in that paper, one can see the business case of applying batteries and PVs in remote areas where, just to highlight it, when I calculated the levelized cost of energy, if I was to use the grid in that specific case, it would have worked out to be around 250 Rand per kilowatt hour. I'm not saying 2.50 Rand, I'm saying 250 Rand per kilowatt hour if you were to calculate all of that. And that is compared to what I calculated to be about 3.50 Rand per kilowatt hour in the case of a microgrid. So the paper is available. I think, I don't know if SAIEE has already published it in their magazines, but I can make it available to you, Program Director. So there is a very good space for to apply batteries within the power system. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think my talk started with the challenges. So as a power system engineer, I need to look at a device and say, can this really help? Or can it help under certain circumstances? So there are positives as well as there are also challenges. And maybe if I still have a second, I can just steal that and say, in that we do have also an application for what we call distribution investment deferral. There are cases for that. There is a project that Eskom is actually pursuing in an area called Swartkoop Dam. That's all. No, not Swartkoop Dam. It's called Rietfontein in the Northern Cape, and I think you may understand why we do get good cases in the Northern Cape because of the vastness of the province itself, and also, being in the desert and having, really sparse communities that sometimes span hundreds of kilometers with nothing before you get to the next community. So it becomes a challenge now to bring infrastructure or to upgrade infrastructure to those areas. So it becomes batteries become a very good a solution where you cannot upgrade your distribution or your transmission infrastructure, and you use a battery, you program it well to charge during certain times where you've got the lowest load, and it must also supply that load when you reach the peak in that specific area. And by so doing, you avoid having to build a long line, you avoid having to build a substation for the specific demand that you have in that. And I can quote another project which is called Elanskop, that is in KZN, being in Maritzburg, being implemented by Eskom. It is there specifically just to deal with the issues of distribution investment deferral. So there are really real applications for the battery, and the system really will smile as we roll out these batteries. And also, I think Maloba mentioned something about being just as we transition, just energy transition. So we need to do whatever we do in a manner that is still just, and that is just to the power system as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and really highlighting the fact that battery storage is really central and critical to the just transition, and secondly quite critical then in terms of I guess broadly the liberalization of the South African energy sector as well, and that there's really a vast amount of opportunities that this industry presents, and I want to conclude or close off this episode with just some concluding remarks from our guests around the future outlook and technology and what the anticipated technological advancements are. And Maloba, I'd like to start with you and just ask you, looking to the future, what are the key developments that you anticipate for battery storage in South Africa's energy mix? And how can the country leverage this technology to lead advancements across the continent?
Yeah, I think it obviously presents quite an interesting opportunity for the country. With batteries, now that we've had experience with hybrid projects, right? So there's some of them, I think I can mention. SCARTech has their PV and battery projects at Kenhardt. And now we're going to have the first standalone utility scale projects connected right at grids. I think the technical learnings are where the most interesting things are going to come from, which is how do we, as we continue further IRP and sort of the plans envisaged there, build out our generation infrastructure, our transmission infrastructure, but also including the technical advantages that Monde has so well described for battery. And for me, if we go to a bid window 8, bid window 9, I would really be excited to see procurement that said a certain percentage of whatever the generation you're offering needs to be battery, so that we have IPPs that are smart, so to speak, right? That are responsive to the needs of the grid, needs of the demand and the country as a whole, and not just powering or providing electrons. The second one that I think is very interesting, and we're starting to see these movements in municipalities, also looking at what does the municipal electricity business model look like going forward. Now, the municipalities had an advantage where their off-takers, people who live there, businesses that are there, are captive. They are within the wires of the municipality. And I think battery storage presents another opportunity where you're saying, look, a lot of businesses, the CNI space, individual homes are also looking at solar PV installations to produce their own electricity. And what if the municipality could say, I will do large scale battery, right? I'll get a good levelized cost of the energy at that stage, at that scale, and you can then produce your own, and I'll give you the services of a battery. And I think if we can get that kind of model happening, then the rest of the continent is going to be a very interesting case of how do we apply that, and not just the model and the procurement, but also businesses like Tumi's business to say, we have this technology, we have the expertise like Monde and the people he works with, that can go and apply this in the rest of the continent. Because that's one thing we've been good at, is exporting technical human capacity. I think the next step is going to also be then exporting the actual goods in terms of locally produced entities or components, and then also these systems, because we've tried them in our system, and we can then export them to the rest of the continent. So that's quite exciting looking forward.
Perfect. Very, very exciting future then that we can expect in the industry. Gracia, I'd like to bring you in and get your views. How do you envision future technological advancements such as AI and Internet of Things having an impact or enhancing the efficiency and management of battery storage systems in South Africa?
Thanks a lot, Thokozile. I think just building from what Maloba was saying. So if you hear, well, based on the conversation today, we've spoken about reliability, we've spoken about the technology, cost, the role that it plays, but key to it is performance, right? And part of the challenge of, let's say, the evolution of the solar industry on the continent has been that, unfortunately, sometimes there has been graveyard projects, right? And I think that the solar, what's exciting about the battery storage industry at the moment is that we get to do this right. We get the chance to, I will say, thrive or so, if I can say it that way. So the potential of artificial intelligence to support the growth of the industry in the context of South Africa, I've heard two main things. One, we talk about performance, and I think Tumi will highlight or will discuss this further, but number of cycles, temperature, charge, discharge rate, to talk about C rate, etc. So, and the ability of the battery energy systems to respond adequately based on the application. We've spoken about grid stability, the ability to manage and balance between power supply, power demand, response effectively to avoid frequency shift, challenges, etc. And then lastly, we've spoken about how important operation and maintenance is to, in fact, optimize the life of this super expensive asset. So when you look at containerized battery storage systems, in my previous life, it was anything between 50 to 60% of the cost. So it really is the largest cost item to your project. And it's important that through the right operation, through optimizing maintenance, and through responding on time, you do not affect negatively the lifespan of this very expensive asset. Artificial intelligence, I see, has the potential to affect all three of these areas quite positively. So through predictive algorithm, for example, when it comes to maintenance, artificial intelligence could predict usage patterns, identify even upcoming faults, prevent that, provide the right, let's say, notice or alert to whoever is in charge of operation and maintenance, and troubleshoot where required. So with the right algorithm, I see, while this is happening, I think most battery energy storage system would have a controller with the ability to do that to some extent, but I see that being optimized almost 1,000-fold going forward. And depending on the application, I'll put Phemelo on the spot for like large-scale users, downtime equals to multiple thousands, if not millions of rand lost. So you really want to avoid that. And I see that artificial intelligence will increasingly play a role in optimizing operation, reducing downtime. Similarly, artificial intelligence, I think at the moment when it comes, we've spoken about the business case of storage, etc. There's a lot of conversation depending on the application, whether it's just backup when load shedding was really prominent, or whether it's peak shaving, etc. And so being able to optimize how to size your storage effectively, I'm sure that many developers at the moment have come up with all kinds of interesting models to try and optimize, you know, the payback period on your project, how to size accordingly and make sure that you essentially optimize the return on investment. And then lastly, I will say I had spoken about maintenance. I will also talk about patterns. So what optimizing again the operations of the batteries, artificial intelligence through a predictive algorithm can help predict, for example, weather patterns. So when we're expecting an excess supply of or excess generation of solar, wind, etc., and then ensure that you balance the ability of the storage system to either store excess power or dispatch, again leading to increased grid stability as well. So those are kind of the key role that I see that artificial intelligence algorithm will play. But there are other technological advancement that I think people, well, right now lithium batteries kind of seems to be the most bankable, but there are others, you know, people have spoken about sodium batteries, etc., etc. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Gracia. Phemelo, I'd like to bring you back in and get a sense from you or hear from you as your concluding remarks, what advice you would offer to South African businesses that are considering battery storage as part of their operations.
Thank you so much, Thokozile. I think we understand that in recent years, South Africa has faced significant challenges with our energy sector, including intermittent power supply and, I could say, unfortunately, unreliable grid infrastructure. Although there has been much improvement, we understand the impact of these issues on the commercial and industrial sphere. These, from an operational point of view, lead to disruptions, decreased productivity, and at the end, financial losses. We all understand that. To address these key challenges, there is a growing need and recommendations for South Africa to try to incorporate battery storage systems into their operations. It may initially be a high capital or perceived as a high capital intense opportunity or road to go through, but however, battery storage offers a reliable and sustainable solution to mitigate power outages and voltage fluctuations, which essentially is crucial for industries that require uninterrupted power, such as manufacturing, mining, milling, and our data centers. So my recommendation is that we try to incorporate battery storage in our operations in order to safeguard operations, minimize downtime, and maintain productivity levels. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Phemelo. And Tumi, I wanted to hear from you then as your concluding remarks around this. What are the opportunities that you see for local entrepreneurs and startups to participate in the growing battery storage industry in South Africa?
The opportunities out there is the growing EV market. I think the regulations in terms of EV, they are becoming much more definite. And so a lot of the companies that are doing stationary storage right now in terms of energy, they probably should be looking at how they fit into the EV value chain. Actually, right now you hear a lot of that if you get to engage with a number of policymakers, and there's opportunities around that. In that the combustion engine as we know it is going to become an iPad on wheels, as we like to say. But there's still opportunities in stationary storage outside of the country, though. There are still countries that are battling a lot of load shedding, as we understand it. They would call it load shedding, but for example, in Zambia, where there's drought, there are countries where they're leapfrogging, so they have not had the opportunity to have a grid to actually talk about. So as a result, they will then do almost your mini grid type, and so there is still a lot of opportunities in that space. And then there's also if you think about energy storage in a sense of a commodity, opportunities on developing the software that makes batteries smarter, and also on the IoT layer. Think about the opportunity to be able to deploy a battery that you can control offsite, so that you do not have to you do not have to rely on an inverter to actually help you control the battery. So there is that opportunity, especially on the IoT side, knowing a lot more about energy and energy usage, so that the battery itself becomes even smarter and can be controlled in line with conditions. In some cases, you need to be able to do what they call arbitrage. Use the battery. You charge the battery with the least amount of cost, and then you use it at the time where it would have cost you a lot more to use energy at that time. And also on the recycling side as well, there is opportunities to look at what happens in 10, 15 years time. In fact, some of the challenges are already imminent right now in terms of how we recycle stationary storage. But for us, the bigger opportunity is really around what the country could be looking at. We have countries in this continent that do have lithium, and they do have other minerals that are related. Those are the countries that should be looking at to localizing their entire manufacturing. But there's a big discussion for another day.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much for that contribution, Tumi. And I think what you've highlighted in terms of the opportunities that are available is that entrepreneurship will really be central or essential for driving innovation in growing the battery storage industry in South Africa. And finally, Monde, I'd like to bring you in for your quick concluding remark. And what I'd like you to focus your remarks on is policy. And what policy change would you recommend to better support battery storage integration in South Africa?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of policy, I think a lot of progress on one side has actually been made, very, very good progress. And I just want to start by stating that first. When we started with the first industrial scale battery energy storage in the country, there was no grid code, which grid code is a policy. And I think right now, if you fast forward up to date, there is a grid code, and I think we've even advanced to some later revisions of the grid code, that has been improved over the years. So I would really like to congratulate the guys in terms of that. And also in terms of technical standards, a lot of good progress has been made there. Hence now, there is confidence even from the IPP office side to say we can go out on IPP procurement processes to procure these things, because there are clear guidelines on how to do it. However, when you start to look at the issues around microgrids, which is, those small isolated grids in the rural and the remote areas, we still lack some policy guidance there. And I understand that the DMRE is also very busy trying to iron out those issues, because you find yourself in a situation where you have a microgrid which is not connected to the main grid, and therefore it doesn't have to meet the requirements of the grid code, because the grid code talks about the mega grid. So now how do you deal with this thing, but you still have customers that are connected here and they need a certain level of supply quality. So, but also it is a standalone grid. So how do you close the gap? So there are activities that are taking place there. And then I think lastly, we need to start now bringing in the grid forming technology, which currently the grid code doesn't really talk to the grid forming technology, but more on grid following technology. So I think those are some of the improvements that need to happen. But at this point, I think in terms of the policy, we, as a country, we are quite okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Monde. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Energy Conversations podcast. Thank you so much to our guests for sharing their insights on battery storage and its potential to reshape South Africa's energy landscape. Today, we've explored the challenges and opportunities that come with this powerful technology and how South Africa can leverage it to create a more stable, resilient, and accessible energy system. To our listeners, thank you for joining in, and until next time, let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe, and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.